The office air had been suffocating me for months. I needed a lungful of something real.
Part 1. The Call of the Mountains. The night it all began, Daniel Carter was not searching for mystery. He wasn't hunting monsters, nor did he expect to find anything other than silence in the folds of the Appalachian wilderness. Yet silence can sometimes be the most terrifying sound of all, because it means something is missing, something that should be alive. Imagine this: a man tired of spreadsheets, choking on office air recycled too many times, trapped in meetings that drained his spirit. A man who once loved the mountains because they made him feel alive, because they gave him freedom no job could offer. That man was Daniel, and on a humid summer morning, he left the safety of city streets and drove deep into the Smokies, telling himself he only wanted peace. But what he found waiting there was not peace. It was something else, something older than him, older than the trails, older perhaps than the church that had been left to rot at the heart of those ridges. And once he stepped off the marked trail, he stepped out of the world he thought he knew. That is where the mystery begins, a mystery so heavy, so steeped in dread, that the only question you'll be able to ask yourself until the very end is, why was that church abandoned, and what lives in the silence it left behind? The road to the Smoky Mountains was long, but Daniel needed every mile of it. His job had swallowed him whole. Deadlines gnawed at him. Managers watched him like predators circling wounded prey, and he could feel himself disappearing one cell at a time. Friends told him to take a vacation, maybe a trip to Florida or California. But Daniel wasn't looking for beaches or palm trees. He wanted the dark green arms of the Appalachians to close around him and remind him he was human. By dawn, his car sat alone in the gravel lot of a trailhead not far from Klingman's Dome. The lot was empty, as he had hoped. He killed the engine, letting the silence settle, and for the first time in weeks he felt his lungs open. Crisp mountain air poured in through the cracked window, carrying scents of pine and wet earth. Daniel pulled on his pack, tightened the straps, and stepped onto the dirt path. His boots sank slightly into soil damp from yesterday's rain. The forest swallowed him instantly, and with each footstep, he left behind the life that had been strangling him. At first, everything felt right. Birdsong fluttered in the canopy. Squirrels darted across fallen logs. The steady beat of his footsteps became a rhythm, a mantra. Left, right, left, right. The first mile slipped by without thought. His muscles stretched, his blood warmed, and the tension in his shoulders began to loosen. But tranquility has a way of blinding you to the shadows. When things feel too perfect, the human mind forgets to ask questions, and Daniel forgot. He didn't notice the way the light dimmed too quickly beneath the trees, or how the birds fell silent in strange intervals, as if they were listening for something else. 2 hours into his hike, he reached a fork. To the right stretched the official trail, marked and maintained, promising scenic overlooks crowded with tourists. To the left, almost invisible, was a faint game path. No signpost, no official marking. Daniel had taken it once before, only for a short distance. This time, though, he paused, staring into its shadowed mouth. Something tugged at him. Curiosity, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. He told himself he wanted adventure. He told himself he wanted solitude. But later, when he remembered this choice, he wondered if something in that forest had been waiting for him all along. Daniel adjusted his pack, breathed in the pine-heavy air, and stepped left. The trail narrowed almost immediately, branches closing in as if the forest was trying to swallow him whole. Sunlight splintered into fragments through the canopy. Every few steps, his pack brushed against leaves that hadn't been trimmed in years. He ducked beneath a fallen pine wedged between two oaks, his fingers brushing moss slick with dew. He glanced at his GPS. It still blinked weakly, a thin thread of signal. But the deeper he went, the weaker that lifeline became. He stopped once to drink from his water bottle, leaning against a moss-covered trunk. The air was cooler here, the shade thick as velvet. He listened. No engines, no distant hum of civilization. Only the faint creak of branches and the occasional crack of something moving in the undergrowth. Then the thunder rolled, distant at first, like a drum beat from some faraway ceremony. Daniel glanced up, but the canopy allowed only scraps of sky, What little he saw had turned from summer blue to ominous gray. He checked his phone. No signal. He told himself it was nothing unusual. Storms swept through these mountains every summer, fierce but fast. He could wait it out, then continue. That was what he told himself. But when the second thunderclap came, closer, sharper, something in his chest tightened. Within minutes, the storm was on him. Lightning cracked through the canopy, illuminating the woods in harsh, white flashes. The thunder wasn't a roll this time. It was an explosion, a concussive force that rattled his bones. Rain hammered the forest floor, turning the trail into mud. His boots slipped, each step more treacherous than the last. Through the downpour, he spotted salvation, a rock formation jutting from the hillside, creating a shallow cave. Half sliding, half scrambling, he threw himself beneath the overhang. Rain cascaded past the lip of stone, a silver curtain that sealed him in. Water streamed down his jacket, soaked his pants, plastered his hair to his skull. He dug into his pack, yanked out an emergency thermal blanket, and wrapped it around his shoulders. Its crinkle was drowned by the storm's roar. Lightning split the sky again, and Daniel saw, just for an instant, an oak 100 yards away explode into splinters as a bolt struck it dead center. That was when the fear began. Not the healthy fear of storms, but something colder, sharper. Because this storm didn't feel like nature. It felt like punishment. The rain pounded for what felt like hours. His watch told him only 40 minutes had passed, but time inside the storm was a different creature. He leaned back against the stone wall, eyelids heavy, body trembling with cold. Sleep took him, though he fought it. When he opened his eyes, the world had changed. The storm was gone. Not a drop of rain fell. The forest stood deathly still, each tree rigid, each branch motionless. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, not even the usual creak of shifting wood. Silence pressed against his ears until he swore he could hear his own blood moving. Daniel stood slowly, his joints stiff from the awkward rest. He stepped out from beneath the rock overhang, blinking in the strange light. It was early afternoon, his watch said, yet everything looked dim, as if twilight had arrived early. The greens of the forest were wrong, not vibrant emerald, but a muted, darker shade, closer to pine than summer leaf. He pulled out his compass. The needle spun lazily, then pointed in a direction that didn't make sense. He shook it. Same result. He checked his GPS. According to its display, he had somehow moved miles from his last position, though he had not left the overhang. He should have turned back. Any rational hiker would have. But curiosity, the same curiosity that had led him down the unmarked path, whispered louder than reason. So Daniel pushed deeper into the woods, every step carrying him further from safety. That was his mistake, and that's where the real story begins. What Daniel found beyond that storm, what he saw in the shadows of the Appalachian wilderness, will not only haunt his every waking moment, it will change the way you think of silence, of abandoned places, of churches that were left to rot for reasons no one dares to speak. Because the question is not just, why was the church abandoned? The question is, what was left inside it when the world walked away? And Daniel Carter, he was about to find out. If you want to know how this mystery unfolds, if you want to walk with Daniel into those woods where silence becomes a living thing, then stay with this story until the very end. But before we go further, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Your support gives us the drive to keep telling stories like this. Dark, chilling, and unforgettable. Subscribe now so you won't miss what comes next. It's part 2. Storms, silence, and shifts in reality. Daniel Carter had always believed storms were temporary things, the kind that sweep in, pound the earth with fury, and then fade to blue skies again. But this storm, the one that had slammed him into the side of the mountain and held him prisoner under a ledge of stone, didn't feel temporary at all. It felt personal. The thunder hadn't simply rolled. It had cracked across his chest like a punishment. The rain hadn't refreshed. It had tried to drown him where he sat. When his eyes had opened after that accidental sleep, the stillness was so complete it strangled him. He stepped from the cave, each movement sharp in the oppressive quiet, his boots squishing in mud that should have been noisy but wasn't. His breathing filled his ears, as though he were trapped inside his own skull. The forest was no longer the forest he had entered. Daniel knew these mountains. He had hiked them for years. He had seen them at dawn, at dusk, in rain, and in blinding sun. But never like this. The colors were dulled, bled of life, as if someone had drained the vibrancy from the leaves and bark. Where there should have been bird calls after the storm, thrilled little songs of survival, there was nothing. Even the insects had vanished. He pulled his compass from his pocket. The needle spun, sluggish and reluctant, before pointing north, or at least what it claimed was north. But the ridge he had tracked earlier told a different story. His GPS, when he checked it, was worse. It claimed he had moved miles in his sleep, carried away without walking a step. He shook it hard, slapped its side, but the display refused to change. Daniel felt a thin rope of panic begin to coil in his gut. He had always trusted his orientation. That trust was cracking now, splintering with every glance at devices that contradicted his own memory. He told himself to breathe, to stay rational. Fear, after all, was the first step toward stupidity. But rationality didn't explain the way the light itself seemed wrong. It wasn't darker exactly. It was colder. Where Appalachian sunlight should have filtered through leaves in warm, golden shafts, this light was bluish, almost aquatic, painting everything in the tones of deep water. Daniel rubbed his eyes, certain it was exhaustion, certain his mind was playing tricks. But when he opened them again, the forest still glowed with that drowned light. He started walking east, or what he believed was east, toward the ridgeline. His boots squelched in the sodden earth, leaving dark prints that seemed to vanish the moment he moved on. His pulse quickened as he climbed, not from exertion but from the sensation that every step carried him deeper into something unfamiliar, a place he hadn't earned the right to enter. Minutes stretched. His watch ticked forward, but time felt loose, distorted. He hiked for 20 minutes, then 30, yet landmarks he thought he knew never appeared. Trees twisted into shapes that looked wrong for these mountains. Some trunks split unnaturally low to the ground, forming contorted arches like gateways into some other domain. The air thickened, heavy with dampness, pressing on his lungs. And then came the smell. At first it was faint, almost ignorable, a damp, sour scent like mushrooms left to rot in a cellar. He thought it might be decay from fallen branches, or the aftermath of lightning striking an animal. But with every step, the odor intensified until it coated the back of his throat. He gagged, pressing a sleeve to his face, but the cloth only trapped the stench. Daniel froze. His body knew before his mind did. This wasn't the smell of forest rot. This was flesh, old flesh, decaying, sweet and rancid, seeping from somewhere close. His instincts screamed to turn back, but some darker pull drove him forward. He told himself he needed to confirm what he suspected, that he couldn't leave without knowing. But deep down, he knew it wasn't curiosity that compelled him. It was something else, something that wanted him to see. Through a gap between two enormous trees, Daniel caught sight of a pale shape against the brown and green. He moved closer, each step hesitant, his body trembling as though preparing for a blow. The shape resolved, and what he saw slammed him like the storm had, but harder, deeper, cutting past reason and straight into terror. It was a person. A body was fixed upright against an oak, pinned there by crude metal spikes driven through wrists and ankles. Even from a distance, Daniel could see the flesh had rotted, peeling back in leathery strips to reveal bone. The face was half gone, eaten by time and insects, but the empty sockets stared out as if still alive. Around the wounds oozed a hardened substance, yellow-green, thick like sap, gluing the corpse to the bark. Daniel stumbled backward, hands shaking violently. His stomach clenched, and he vomited into the undergrowth, choking on bile. When he wiped his mouth, the taste lingered, mingling with the stink of the body. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't nature. Someone had done this. Someone had chosen this tree, chosen these spikes, chosen to display a human being as though the forest itself needed a warning sign. And Daniel had ignored that warning. He fumbled for his phone, but the screen glared back with its mocking message. No service. Not even emergency calls. His compass needle twitched again, swinging with indecision. GPS still insisted he was miles away from where he stood. He pressed his back to a tree, heart pounding so hard it made his vision blur. His first thought was to turn and run, to get out by any means necessary. But then he saw something else at the edge of his vision. Straight lines, angles that didn't belong to the wilderness. A building. Daniel's breath caught. He stepped forward, brushing branches aside, and there it was in a clearing. A church. Or what had once been one. Its wood was gray, weathered, nearly the same color as the trees. The steeple was broken, leaning like a snapped bone. Windows gaped empty, their glass shattered years ago. Ivy crawled up the sides, pulling the structure back into the earth. For a fleeting moment, relief flared in Daniel's chest. Civilization, shelter, proof that he wasn't entirely alone in this warped forest. But then he saw the markings. The same yellow-green substance that glued the corpse to its oak was smeared across the church walls. Symbols, crude and sharp, scratched into patterns Daniel didn't recognize. They pulsed faintly in the cold light, slick against the rotting wood. They weren't random. They were deliberate. Every part of him screamed to stay away. But logic whispered that a church, even abandoned, meant 4 walls and a roof. Night was coming. He needed shelter. He needed time to think. He needed to survive. Daniel stood at the edge of the clearing, torn between 2 instincts, the primal urge to flee and the calculated need to endure. His hand hovered near the strap of his pack, fingers twitching. The silence pressed closer, as though waiting for his decision. And then he stepped forward. The porch groaned under his weight. One of the double doors hung loose, the other missing entirely. He peered inside. Dust swirled in beams of fading light. Rows of pews stretched toward a simple altar. For a moment it was almost ordinary. Almost. Until his eyes adjusted to the dim. The first shape he saw stopped him cold. A figure stretched across the altar, arms and legs pinned wide with iron spikes, just like the body outside. Flesh had withered, but the arrangement was unmistakable. Ritual, display, cruelty. Then he saw more. A woman seated in the front pew, hands folded in her lap as though in prayer. Except her head was missing, and the stump of her neck gleamed with the same hardened yellow-green resin. Children. 3 of them. One kneeling in a corner, clasping hands as if in innocent devotion. Another leaning against the wall, frozen in play. The third suspended from the rafters by wires, limbs dangling like a puppet's. Daniel's breath rasped loud in the cavernous silence. His legs buckled and he stumbled backward onto the porch, retching violently. The smell of death clung to the air, heavy, oppressive, undeniable. This wasn't random. This wasn't madness. This was message. This was ritual. And Daniel Carter had walked straight into it. He wiped his mouth with a trembling hand, fighting the urge to bolt into the woods. But before he could make a choice, a sound cut through the silence. A voice. Calm, casual, human. They make such interesting sounds when they die. Daniel's head snapped toward the altar. From behind it, a tall figure stepped forward, his movements unhurried, confident. His hair was long and matted, hanging in greasy clumps. His clothes, once ordinary outdoor wear, were streaked with dark stains and that same yellow-green substance. His face was gaunt, weathered, skin stretched tight over sharp bones. But it was his eyes that froze Daniel. Pale, alert, studying him not as one human studies another, but as a predator studies prey. The man smiled faintly. Most people run right away. You stayed longer than most. Curious type, aren't you? Daniel's throat was dry. Words tangled there, refusing to form. He stumbled back another step, the porch groaning beneath him. The man tilted his head. I'm Richard, he said. His voice was steady, conversational, as if this introduction were taking place at a campsite and not in a temple of horror. And you've wandered somewhere you really shouldn't be. Daniel's mouth finally opened, his voice thin, trembling. I'm just trying to get back to the trail. Richard's smile widened. There is no trail back to where you came from, not anymore. And with that, the silence of the Appalachian woods deepened into something else, something alive, something waiting. The storm had ended, the silence had begun, and Daniel Carter was now part of whatever had claimed this place. Part 3. The Body in the Church. The name alone, Richard, shouldn't have carried weight. It was ordinary, the kind of name a banker or a mechanic might have, someone you could bump into at the grocery store. But in the hollow quiet of that abandoned Appalachian church, the sound of it twisted into something venomous. Richard didn't look like a man introducing himself. He looked like a hunter announcing ownership of prey. Daniel's throat was still raw from bile, his body trembling in violent pulses. He staggered back another step, his boot heel scraping the porch edge. Below him, the clearing stretched like an open mouth, the tree line standing motionless beyond. If he bolted now, he could disappear into the woods. But Richard didn't move. He only tilted his head, pale eyes glittering with amusement, as though daring Daniel to try. "You've seen more than most," Richard said softly. His voice was calm, even warm, but underneath lay something serrated. "Most stumble onto the warnings outside, and that's enough. They turn back. They don't linger." Daniel's eyes flicked involuntarily toward the nailed body on the oak tree behind him, then back to the horror arranged inside the church. He swallowed hard, the taste of rot thick on his tongue. "Why?" The word came out cracked, almost inaudible. "Why would anyone—" Richard chuckled, a low sound. "Because people need reminders, boundaries, a line carved in bone and resin, so they know where they don't belong." He stepped closer to the altar, his boots silent against the warped floorboards. His hand brushed across the pinned corpse stretched there. The hardened yellow-green substance flaked from the wood like old sap. "This is our line, our territory, and you've crossed it." The word "our" snagged Daniel's attention like a hook. He wasn't alone. Richard must have seen the realization spark in Daniel's eyes. His smile broadened, humorless. "Brothers," he called, not loudly, but with absolute confidence the walls would carry his voice. From the shadows behind the pews, movement stirred. Daniel's pulse spiked, and he took another involuntary step backward, his heel nearly slipping from the porch. Figures emerged one by one, as if peeled from the dark. The first was broad-shouldered, thick-bearded, carrying an axe so worn it looked older than the church itself. His shirt was ripped, soaked with stains Daniel didn't want to identify. Richard gestured lazily. "James!" Another followed, lankier, with pale blonde hair and a long hunting knife dangling from his hand. His grin was sharp, childish, wrong. "Thomas!" The last stepped forward from the far corner, slower than the others. His frame was lean, wiry, his expression cold, detached. Unlike the others, he carried no visible weapon, but his hands flexed like he didn't need one. "William!" Daniel's stomach plummeted. 3 of them. 4, counting Richard. His mind calculated odds instinctively. Weight, speed, distance to the tree line. But each number ended in failure. Richard stepped down from the altar, his boots sinking into the warped boards with a groan. "You weren't invited here, Daniel," he said, his tone still conversational. "But maybe it's fate. You needed to see. You needed to understand what happens when the outside world forgets its place." Daniel's voice cracked again, harsher this time. "You killed them." His hand jerked toward the grotesque figures arranged like puppets. "That family. You." Richard's gaze sharpened, and for the first time his warmth vanished. "They wandered in. They stayed too long. They learned." He paused, studying Daniel as though cataloging him. "And so will you." The words ignited panic in Daniel's chest. He pivoted sharply, vaulting off the porch into the clearing, his boots pounding against damp grass. He didn't think, didn't plan, only ran. Branches clawed his arms as he tore toward the tree line, lungs burning with the promise of escape. Behind him, laughter rang out. Not frantic, not strained, just amused. Like men watching a rabbit dart across an open field. Daniel plunged into the trees, his breath ragged, his heart hammering. He veered left, then right, forcing a zigzag, trying to break line of sight. His mind screamed at him to stay silent, but his body betrayed him with every crunch of leaves, every desperate gasp. Then ahead, movement. A shape burst from behind a trunk. The blond man, Thomas, grinning wide, knife glinting. Daniel skidded, turned sharply, sprinted in another direction. Behind him he heard Thomas's laughter echo, high and mocking. Daniel's foot caught on a root. He pitched forward, crashing into the earth. Mud smeared his palms, grit filling his mouth. He scrambled to rise, only to feel a shadow fall across him. "Running's no good," a deep voice rumbled. James loomed, axe in hand, his bulk blocking the fading light. Daniel rolled, instincts flaring, and snatched a jagged branch from the ground. He swung wildly, the wood cracking against James's knee. The man grunted, staggering, and Daniel surged up, driving forward through a gap between trees. Branches whipped his face, slicing skin. His lungs screamed. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. He didn't know where he was running, only that he couldn't stop. Then hands clamped onto his shoulders from behind. He was yanked backward, slammed hard into a trunk. The impact rattled his teeth. William's face hovered inches from his, expression blank, eyes cold. Daniel struggled, thrashing, but William's grip was iron. Richard's voice drifted through the trees, calm, almost pleased. "That's enough." The three brothers held Daniel fast as Richard emerged into the clearing, unhurried. He crouched before Daniel, tilting his head like a man examining a specimen. "You've got fight, I'll give you that. Most crumble quicker. But you see, it doesn't matter how fast you run, how clever you are. These woods belong to us. And once you've stepped off the path, there's no going back." Daniel spat blood from his split lip, his chest heaving. "Why? Why the church? Why the bodies?" Richard's smile returned, thin and cruel. He gestured to the resin-streaked symbols painted on the trees around them. "Because fear works better when it's permanent. Nature erases too quickly. Rot, rain, scavengers. But this..." He reached down, swiped a finger across the hardened yellow-green substance, clinging to Daniel's sleeve from the struggle. "This lasts." Daniel recoiled, the resin sticky, foul. His skin crawled where it touched. Richard straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "Take him." The brothers didn't hesitate. They dragged Daniel through the trees, his boots scraping against roots and stones. He twisted, kicked, but each strike met solid muscle. The forest seemed to close around them, the silence thicker now, pressing against his skull until his own screams sounded muffled. Through gaps in the branches he glimpsed the church again, its leaning steeple jagged against the dim sky. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw figures in the windows, watching, unmoving. But when he blinked, they were gone. They hauled him past the nailed corpse, its empty sockets fixed in eternal warning. Past the clearing, back inside the church. The stench struck him again, hot and cloying, coating his tongue. They threw him down before the altar, where the spiked body still stretched in silent agony. Daniel's head cracked against the wood floor, stars bursting across his vision. He groaned, rolling onto his side. Richard knelt beside him, voice dropping low. "This place, it isn't abandoned. It's alive, and now you're part of it." Daniel's chest heaved, panic clawing at him. He scanned the pews, the grotesque tableau of death. His eyes lingered on the children's frozen forms, their small hands clasped as if in eternal prayer. His stomach churned. He thought of his sister's kids back home, the way they laughed without fear, and rage ignited beneath the terror. "I won't be part of this," Daniel rasped. Richard's smile faded. He leaned closer, whispering against Daniel's ear. "You don't get to choose." The words coiled around Daniel's spine, colder than the storm had ever been. And as the church creaked under the weight of shadows, he realized he was no longer an intruder. He was a captive. The detective in him, the rational man who solved problems, who managed crises at work, who navigated life with logic, fought to stay awake. His mind cataloged every detail, the brothers' positions, the layout of the church, the strength of the resin. Because somewhere inside the terror, another truth pulsed. If he didn't start planning now, he would end up like the family nailed to these walls. The investigation had begun. But the crime scene was alive, and Daniel Carter had just become evidence. Part 4: Captivity, Escape, and the Hunt. The rope cut into Daniel's chest with every breath, binding him tight against the rough oak trunk. His arms were wrenched behind him, wrists cinched by plastic zip ties so tight that his fingers had already begun to tingle. The bark bit into his skin. He shifted slightly, but even that small movement sent a flare of pain through his shoulders. The fire in the center of the clearing snapped and popped, sending sparks spiraling into the night. The brothers sat around it, James, Thomas, William, each radiating a different kind of menace. James hunched forward, sharpening the blade of his axe with a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape setting Daniel's teeth on edge. Thomas twirled his knife idly, tossing it into the dirt and yanking it back up again, each throw landing inches from his bare foot. William sat silently, eyes scanning the dark tree line, posture tense and coiled like a predator. Richard stood near the fire, his shoulder wrapped in a blood-stained bandage where Daniel's small knife had pierced him earlier. The wound hadn't slowed him. If anything, it seemed to amuse him. He cradled a metal cup in one hand, sipping slowly, never taking his eyes off Daniel. "You see," Richard began, his voice steady and conversational, as though they were old friends catching up. "There's freedom in this. Out there," he gestured vaguely toward the mountains. "You belong to someone else. Your boss, your mortgage, your wife, your kids. Out here, you belong to yourself. Nothing but the trees and the blood in your veins." Daniel swallowed against the dryness in his throat. "Freedom? You call murdering families freedom?" Thomas's knife clattered against the ground as he burst out laughing, high-pitched and mocking. "Listen to him, Rich, like he's got a say in definitions." James grunted, not looking up from his axe. "Talk less. You'll scare him too quick." Richard only smiled, stepping closer until his boots were inches from Daniel's knees. He crouched, placing the cup gently on the dirt beside him. "You're smart. You notice things. That's why you saw the resin, the symbols, the way the woods shifted after the storm. You're paying attention. That's rare." Daniel tried to steady his voice. "If you let me go, I won't tell anyone. I'll forget I ever saw you. No one has to know." Richard's pale eyes glinted. "That's the problem, Daniel. We can't afford belief. We need certainty." He stood, turning to the others. "In the morning, we'll ask him questions. Find out who he really is, who he told. Then," his smile returned, thin and cruel, "we'll make sure he never tells anyone else." Daniel's stomach dropped. His body shook with exhaustion and fear, but his mind refused to shut down. He forced himself to focus on details. The knot of rope binding his chest, the way the zip ties pressed into his wrists, the position of the brothers around the fire. He needed a plan, not panic. Time dragged like an anchor. The fire burned lower, the night deepening around them. Crickets should have been singing, owls hooting, but the forest remained suffocatingly silent. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. At some point, Tom's head began to nod, his shotgun still balanced across his knees. James leaned back against a log, whetstone forgotten in his hand. William had disappeared into the tree line on some unseen patrol. Richard remained awake, but eventually he stretched out near the fire, his bandaged shoulder twitching with each breath. This was his chance. Daniel shifted, pressing his wrists harder against the bark of the oak. Pain seared his skin, but he welcomed it. The rough ridges scraped the plastic, tiny frays biting into the material. He worked slowly, rhythmically, pretending to sag against the ropes whenever one of the men stirred. His hands were slick with blood and sweat by the time he felt the zip tie begin to weaken. Snap. The sound was almost imperceptible, but to Daniel it thundered like a gunshot. He froze, holding his breath. Thomas stirred, scratching his chin, then slumped again. Daniel forced himself to remain calm. He slid his wrists free, then reached up, fumbling with the knot binding his chest. His fingers were numb, clumsy, but desperation gave him strength. The rope loosened inch by inch until finally it slipped low enough for him to wriggle free. He didn't run immediately. Instead, he crouched, scanning the camp. The brothers breathed heavily in their sleep, their faces lit by the dying glow of the fire. Richard shifted once, muttering something in his dreams. Daniel spotted his pack leaning against a tree, half open, contents spilling. He crept forward, heart hammering, every step a scream in his ears. He snatched the pack, yanking it over his shoulder. His boot nudged a loose stone, sending it skittering across the dirt. Tom's eyes snapped open. For one heartbeat, neither moved. Then Tom's lips peeled back in a grin. "Rob," he rasped. "He's loose!" Chaos erupted. Richard bolted upright, eyes wild, hand diving for his knife. James surged forward, axe swinging. William's silhouette appeared at the edge of the clearing, racing toward them. Daniel didn't wait. He sprinted into the forest, branches whipping his face, roots tearing at his boots. Shouts exploded behind him. Flashlights flared, beams slicing through the dark. "East side, cut him off!" Richard's voice boomed. Gunfire cracked, splintering bark inches from Daniel's head. He ducked, lungs burning, legs pumping harder than they ever had. He didn't think about direction, only distance. Every step forward was survival, but they knew the forest better than he did. Flashlights converged on his left. A voice shouted ahead. He veered sharply, tumbling down a slope, rolling through mud and leaves. He crashed to a stop at the bottom, gasping, his ankles screaming in protest. Pain flared, but he forced himself upright. The silence returned. Thick and wrong. Only his ragged breathing filled the air. Then laughter, high and gleeful. Thomas's voice echoed between the trees. "Rabbit thinks he's clever." Daniel stumbled forward, adrenaline drowning the pain in his ankle. He had to keep moving, had to. He glanced at the sky through breaks in the canopy. The moon hung low, pale light spilling across the forest. He fixed it to his left shoulder, using it as his only compass. Another gunshot split the air. Bark exploded near his face. "They want me alive," Daniel whispered to himself, a mantra against the terror. "They won't risk it. Not yet." Still, the bullets came close enough to kiss. He ran until his legs buckled, then crawled, dragging himself through undergrowth. Twigs snapped under his palms. Every sound seemed to betray him. Behind, the hunters fanned out, their voices weaving through the night. "He's slowing. Cut him off at the ridge. Don't let him reach the road." Daniel's breath came in shallow bursts. His vision swam. Then ahead, a fallen log loomed. He dropped behind it, pressing himself flat against the earth. His heartbeat thundered in his skull. He bit his lip until he tasted blood, forcing himself silent. Flashlights swept the clearing. One beam lingered on the log. "Check behind it," Richard ordered. Footsteps approached. Daniel clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. He found a rock beside him, jagged and heavy. He wrapped trembling fingers around it, waiting. The flashlight rose, casting him in harsh white light. Tom's grin split his face. "Found him." Daniel surged upward, slamming the rock into Tom's wrist. The flashlight tumbled away, the beam spinning wildly. Daniel bolted, crashing through the underbrush. Shouts erupted again, closer than ever. "Heading east! Cut him off!" Daniel's ankle screamed with each step. His arms stung from countless scratches, but he kept running. Ahead, the trees thinned. A faint slope descended into darkness. His heart leapt. Downhill meant water. Water meant people. Then, a shot. Fire seared across his upper arm. He stumbled, clutching the wound, hot blood slicking his fingers. Behind him, Richard's voice roared. "Alive, damn it! Alive!" Daniel forced himself forward, vision blurring, every breath a ragged sob. His mind screamed with images of the nailed body, the mutilated family in the church. Richard's pale eyes. He couldn't stop. Couldn't. The forest itself seemed to fight him now. Branches clawing, roots grabbing, shadows shifting unnaturally. The silence pressed closer, thicker, as though the woods themselves were complicit. Daniel crashed onward, guided only by desperation, but the hunters were closing in, and the night had only just begun. Part 5. Escape, Aftermath, and Lingering Shadows. Daniel's lungs were fire, each breath tearing through him like broken glass. His legs threatened to give out at every step, his ankle screaming from the fall, his arm slick with blood where the bullet had grazed him. But he ran. God, he ran. Behind him, the hunters' shouts fractured the silence, their flashlights slicing through the dark like searching blades. Every instinct begged him to collapse, to curl into the dirt and vanish. But another instinct, fiercer, deeper, born in the marrow of survival, dragged him forward. He couldn't stop. Not here. Not when he could still taste the stench of rot from the church in his throat. Not when Richard's pale eyes burned into the back of his skull. The slope grew steeper, earth crumbling under his boots. He half slid, half stumbled down, branches clawing at his arms. The silence of the unnatural forest made his ragged breathing sound monstrous. Too loud, too human. He forced himself onward. Then, something new. A sound that didn't belong to these woods. Engines. Low, distant, steady. Daniel's heart lurched. A road. Civilization. A lifeline. He pushed harder, ignoring the pain, ignoring the blood soaking his sleeve. He crashed through undergrowth, each stride carrying him closer to salvation. The sound of engines grew louder, headlights flashing faintly between the trees. And then he saw it, the glint of asphalt, a strip of highway cutting through the mountains. He stumbled from the tree line, boots hitting gravel, then hard blacktop. The sudden openness of the road made him dizzy. His arms flailed, waving frantically. A pair of headlights rounded the bend. A truck roared closer, horn blaring as the driver spotted the wild figure stumbling into its lane. Brakes screeched. The truck ground to a halt just feet away. The driver, a broad man with graying hair and wide eyes, flung open his door. "Jesus Christ, what the hell? Are you hurt?" Daniel collapsed against the truck, words spilling out in gasps. "Help, please. They're after me." Behind him at the edge of the trees, 4 figures stood. Richard, James, Thomas, William. They didn't charge. They didn't shout. They only watched, eyes gleaming in the truck's headlights. Richard raised one hand, his pale smile cutting through the dark. His lips moved, forming words Daniel could hear even without sound. "We'll find you." "Get in!" the driver barked, hauling Daniel into the passenger seat. The door slammed shut. Tires squealed, gravel spraying, and the truck roared forward, leaving the tree line behind. Daniel sagged against the seat, chest heaving, tears mixing with sweat and blood. The driver glanced at him, face pale. "My name's Mark Jensen. We're getting you to a hospital. Hold on, son." Daniel nodded weakly, but his eyes stayed fixed on the side mirror. The figures at the tree line were gone. The hospital lights stabbed at Daniel's eyes. Too bright, too clean. Machines beeped steadily, a cruel contrast to the silence that still echoed in his head. Bandages wrapped his arm, his ankle was braced, IV lines snaked into his veins. Doctors murmured, nurses bustled, but their voices felt far away, muted under the roar of memory. Detective Sarah Collins entered his room 3 days later, a notepad in hand. Her expression was professional, but her eyes carried curiosity and skepticism. She sat beside his bed, leaning forward. "Mr. Carter, you've been through hell, but I need you to walk me through it again, from the beginning." Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to refuse, to let silence swallow the nightmare, but he couldn't. The images burned too deep. So he told her. About the storm, the silence, the corpse nailed to the tree, about the church smeared with resin and the family arranged like grotesque dolls, about Richard and his brothers, their camp, their hunt. Sarah wrote steadily, her pen scratching across paper. When he finished, she exhaled slowly. "Our search teams went in yesterday. They found nothing. No church, no bodies, no camp." Daniel's pulse spiked. "That's impossible. I saw them. I bled there." "The church?" Sarah's gaze softened slightly, pity creeping into her professional mask. "Sometimes trauma distorts memory. You were injured, dehydrated, disoriented. Storms in these mountains can displace hikers for miles." "No," Daniel hissed, sitting upright despite the pain in his ribs. "This wasn't in my head. They're real. Richard is real." Sarah closed her notebook. "We'll keep searching, but until we have evidence..." She hesitated, then rose. Rest, Mr. Carter. You're safe now. Safe. The word rattled through Daniel's skull like a cruel joke. Weeks passed. The hospital discharged him into a small motel in Asheville, paid for by the state until he recovered enough to return home. He tried to sleep, tried to eat, but the woods still clung to him. At night, he woke drenched in sweat, the smell of resin filling his nostrils. He swore he heard children's laughter in the hall, high and thin, like the frozen echoes from the church. Sometimes, when headlights passed outside his window, he saw pale eyes glinting in the reflection. The police called twice, each time with the same message. No evidence, no church, no bodies, no sign of Richard or his brothers. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole, erasing every trace. But Daniel knew better. One evening, limping back from the motel vending machine, he stopped cold. On his doorframe, smeared faintly across the peeling paint, was a mark, yellow-green, hardened, resin. His hands shook as he reached out, touching it. Sticky, real. His chest tightened. His vision narrowed. They had been here. They knew where he slept. Daniel Carter never returned to the mountains. He refused to set foot on a trail again, refused to breathe the air of those ridges. But the question haunted him, gnawed at him, hollowed him from within. Why was that church abandoned? The answer, he realized, was worse than he had ever imagined. Because it hadn't been abandoned at all. It had been claimed. And the ones who claimed it were still out there, waiting in the silence, their resin marks spreading like a disease across bark, stone, and now his own doorframe. Richard's voice echoed in his skull, calm and certain. We'll find you. We'll find everyone you care about. Daniel Carter had escaped, but the story wasn't over. The silence had followed him home.